The weight of a single bolt of fustian cloth was not something a man like Bartholomew could ever truly forget. It was a dense, heavy fabric, a humble blend of linen warp and cotton weft, and in the year 1345, in the bustling, mud-caked streets of Norwich, it was the very thread of his existence. You, a modern person accustomed to the fleeting lightness of synthetic fabrics and the endless variety of fast fashion, would find it almost impossibly coarse and heavy. But for Bartholomew, a cloth merchant of modest means, this fabric was a monument to painstaking labor, a testament to the quiet, unglamorous machinery that kept the medieval world turning. His days were not filled with heroic quests or courtly intrigues. Instead, they were governed by the methodical, almost hypnotic rhythm of business, the haggling for raw cotton from distant lands, the careful measurement of linen threads, the constant, low-level anxiety of a shipment delayed by a swollen river. This was the true history of the Middle Ages, not the clatter of swords, but the persistent hum of the loom. The fustian that Bartholomew traded was not a luxury item. It was the stuff of everyday life, the kind of cloth used for sturdy tunics, simple gowns, and the linings of more expensive garments. It was a workhorse fabric, durable and dirt cheap, and its value lay not in its beauty, but in its utility. To understand Bartholomew's world, you must first understand the journey of this cloth. It began thousands of miles away, in the fields of the Levant, where cotton was grown and harvested under the blistering sun. The logistics of its arrival in Norwich were a marvel of slow, painstaking coordination. Caravans would carry the bales overland, where they would eventually be loaded onto ships that navigated the unpredictable Mediterranean and Atlantic, a journey fraught with storms and the ever-present threat of piracy. Each stage of this process was documented in painstakingly written ledgers, and a single mistake, a forgotten tax, a miscalculated weight, could spell disaster for a small merchant. Bartholomew's shop was a cramped, dark space, smelling of dust, mildew, and the faint, earthy scent of raw wool. Rolls of fabric, each one a testament to weeks of human labor, were stacked precariously against the walls. His most prized possession was not a jewel or a fine piece of furniture, but his ledger book. Bound in worn leather, its pages were filled with his meticulous, spidery script, each entry a record of a sale, a purchase, or a debt. This was his world map, his grand strategy, the document that allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval commerce. He would spend hours hunched over it, his quill scratching softly on the vellum, a single candle casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The numbers were his language, the debits and credits his poetry. He wasn't a hero, but a keeper of accounts, a quiet guardian of the economic engine that powered his town. His life was a series of mundane calculations. How much would a shipment of linen cost from Flanders? What was the going rate for a pound of cotton from Venice? What was the best way to transport a dozen bolts of cloth to a buyer in London, avoiding the bandits on the King's Highway and the exorbitant tolls at every bridge? These were the questions that occupied his mind, not the grand narratives of kings and battles. He knew, with a certainty that only a man who deals in tangible goods can possess, that the fall of a kingdom was often less impactful on the daily lives of people than the sudden, unexpected rise in the price of raw cotton. He understood that history was built not on the proclamations of emperors, but on the small, consistent transactions of countless individuals like himself. The concept of profit was a delicate, often elusive thing. Bartholomew did not operate on a modern markup model. His income was derived from the subtle, intricate dance of supply and demand, from his ability to secure a good price for his raw materials and his skill in haggling for a favorable price for the finished cloth. He was a professional risk-taker, though the risks were not those of a knight in shining armor. His risks were floods that could ruin a shipment, bad debts that could bankrupt him, and the constant, low-level threat of disease that could sweep through the town and halt all trade. His greatest strength was his network, the weavers he commissioned in the surrounding villages, the carters he trusted to carry his goods, and the other merchants in the guild hall with whom he shared information and, on occasion, a jug of weak ale. The rhythm of his life was tied to the seasons and the market days. In the spring, he would finalize his orders, sending his agents to coastal towns to await the ships carrying the exotic goods of the East. In the summer, his looms would be busy, the rhythmic clatter of their shuttles a constant backdrop to the town's life. In the autumn, he would be at the height of his trade, his shop a whirlwind of activity, as peasants and townsfolk alike prepared for the long, cold winter. The winter months were for accounting, for settling his debts and preparing his plans for the next year. It was a life of quiet diligence, of small victories and minor defeats, a life that, in its very mundanity, was a perfect example of human endurance. He often wondered, as he tallied his accounts by the flickering candlelight, about the people at the other end of his trade. The families who wore his fustian, who used it to line their cloaks against the biting wind, or to make a sturdy tunic for a child. He never met them, but he knew they were out there, a vast, anonymous network of humanity whose lives were, in some small, unacknowledged way, tied to the fortunes of his humble shop. It was a profound thought, the idea that a single bolt of cloth could connect a cotton grower in Syria to a peasant in the English countryside, a silent testament to the invisible threads of a global economy that existed long before the term was ever coined. He knew his work was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of ballads or epic poems. But without it, the history of the world would have been a very different story indeed. How, then, did a man like Bartholomew, a silent cog in a vast and complex machine, manage to survive the one event that would threaten to unravel every single thread of his meticulously woven life, the arrival of the great pestilence? The year 1348 was not a time of knights or kings for Bartholomew, it was the year the invisible thread of his existence began to fray. You, a modern person with access to instant communication and global supply chains, cannot truly grasp the terrifying isolation and suddenness with which the Black Death arrived. For Bartholomew, it did not appear as a headline in a newspaper or a breaking news alert. It arrived as a whisper, a rumor carried on the wind from the seaports of Weymouth and Bristol, a rumor of a strange and terrible plague that had swept through the lands of the Saracens and was now making its way up the great rivers of England. At first, it was a distant problem, a matter for prayer and vague concern, a topic for solemn discussion over a pint of ale. The looms still clattered, the carts still rumbled, and the business of cloth went on. But slowly, inexorably, the whispers grew louder, and the rhythm of life began to falter. The first signs for Bartholomew were not the sickness itself, but the disruption of the small, intricate network of his trade. A carter he had used for years to transport goods to London did not show up for their scheduled rendezvous. A weaver from a nearby village, known for his speed and skill, failed to deliver a bolt of cloth on time. At first, Bartholomew chalked it up to the usual vagaries of life, a broken axle, a family illness. But as the delays became more frequent and the excuses more vague, a cold dread began to settle in his gut. The flow of raw materials, the very lifeblood of his business, began to slow to a trickle. Shipments of cotton from distant lands ceased altogether. The carefully balanced ecosystem of his livelihood, a system built on trust, routine, and the assumption of continuity, was beginning to collapse. Bartholomew's ledger book, once a source of comfort and control, now became a document of mounting despair. He would turn its pages and see the names of men who were now silent, their debts unpaid, their future orders left unfulfilled. The entries that once spoke of future prosperity now read like an elegy for a dying world. His world was shrinking, his gaze no longer fixed on the distant shores of Venice or the looms of Flanders, but on the increasingly empty streets of Norwich. The town, once a symphony of life, the shouts of merchants, the cries of street vendors, the constant chatter of a bustling population, was becoming a place of eerie, unnatural quiet. Shops were shuttered, market stalls stood abandoned, and the scent of death began to hang in the air, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that clung to everything. The arrival of the plague was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping horror that seeped into every aspect of daily life. The first to go were the weakest, the old, the very young, and the poor, living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Bartholomew saw the toll carts rumbling through the streets at all hours, their drivers shouting, "Bring out your dead," in a hoarse, mournful cry. He saw the faces of his neighbors, once familiar and full of life, now gaunt with fear and grief. He barricaded his doors, not against bandits, but against a microscopic enemy he could not see or understand. He washed his hands with lye soap more frequently, a small, superstitious act of defiance against a force that defied all reason. The fear was a living thing, a shadow that followed him, and it was perhaps the most potent force of all. His business, once the center of his universe, now felt utterly pointless. Who needed a new tunic when the Grim Reaper himself was a frequent visitor? The demand for cloth had vanished. His customers were either dead, dying, or in hiding. He had a small family to care for, and the simple act of finding food and fresh water became a daily struggle. The local farms were deserted, their fields left to rot. The supply of grain and meat, once plentiful, was now a matter of dangerous foraging. Bartholomew, a man whose life had been about numbers and ledgers, was now forced to confront a reality that could not be quantified. He was a survivor, not by choice, but by circumstance, and his survival was a lonely, terrifying ordeal. The most difficult part was the loss of his network. The men he had known for decades, the weavers, the carters, the merchants, they were disappearing, one by one. The social fabric of his world, as strong and intricate as the fustian he sold, was tearing apart. He had always relied on the slow, steady hum of human connection to keep his business afloat. Now, that hum had been replaced by a deafening silence. The Guild Hall, once a place of boisterous meetings and shared camaraderie, stood empty. The news from London was a source of despair. The city, once a grand hub of commerce, was a ghost town, and the few remaining merchants who had survived were hoarding their goods, refusing to sell. The entire system of credit, of trust, of mutual obligation, which was the very foundation of the medieval economy, had simply ceased to exist. Bartholomew's story is not about the grand sweep of history, but about the minute, personal apocalypse that unfolded in the lives of ordinary people. He was not a warrior facing an enemy on a battlefield, but a man facing the slow, methodical breakdown of everything he knew and understood. The great pestilence did not just kill, it erased. It wiped away the systems, the networks, and the quiet certainties that had defined a civilization. It left him, a man of quiet diligence, standing alone in a world that had suddenly become hostile and unrecognizable. His greatest fear was not that he would die, but that his entire life's work, every ledger entry, every bolt of fustian, every hard-won negotiation, would simply cease to matter. As the months bled into a year, and the terror of the plague began to subside, a new, unforeseen challenge arose. The great pestilence had done its horrific work, and now the world was to be reborn. But in this new world, with so many gone, who would do the work? And more importantly, how would a man like Bartholomew, a quiet survivor, rebuild his life when the very foundations of his trade had been shattered? The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was not a return to the past, it was an entirely new, unsettling landscape. For Bartholomew, the survivor, the great challenge was not the plague itself but the societal and economic upheaval it left in its wake. You, accustomed to a world of stable economies and predictable labor markets, must imagine the profound shock of a sudden, cataclysmic shift in the very foundations of society. The plague had done the impossible, it had turned the medieval labor structure on its head. With a third of the population gone, labor was no longer a cheap, abundant resource. Suddenly, a carter was a man of immense value. A skilled weaver was a commodity to be bargained for. The balance of power, for the first time in centuries, had shifted from the lord and the merchant to the common worker. Bartholomew's first instinct was to resume his old routines, to pick up his ledger and his quill and pretend that the world had not changed. But the old rules no longer applied. His remaining weavers, once content with their meager pay, now demanded higher wages. The cost of raw materials, once low and predictable, had skyrocketed. The small-scale farmers and serfs who had once been his primary customers were now landowners in their own right, having inherited land from deceased relatives. They had money, and they were no longer desperate for the cheapest cloth. The demand for the humble fustian was waning, replaced by a growing appetite for finer, more expensive fabrics like broadcloth and silk. His entire business model, built on the mass production of a cheap, sturdy fabric for the masses, was now obsolete. The New World demanded a new kind of merchant. It required flexibility, an ability to adapt to a reality that was constantly in flux. Bartholomew had to learn to operate in a market where labor was king. He could no longer simply dictate terms, he had to negotiate. He had to offer incentives, promise better wages, and build a new network of trust with the few remaining skilled laborers. He also had to shift his product line. He began to experiment with more luxurious blends of wool and linen, catering to the newly affluent class of commoners. His ledger, once a record of countless small transactions, began to document a few, larger, more significant sales. The volume of his business was lower, but the profit margin on each sale was higher. He was no longer a purveyor of the mundane, but a supplier of a modest kind of luxury. This transition was not easy. It required a complete change in mindset. Bartholomew had to let go of the old ways of doing things, the rhythms that had defined his life for decades. He had to become a student of the new world, to listen to the whispers of the market, to understand the aspirations of a population that had been irrevocably changed by a shared trauma. He learned that the plague had not just killed people, it had broken down the rigid social hierarchy that had existed for centuries. It had given ordinary people a new sense of their own value and power. It was a terrifying, chaotic time, but for those who survived and adapted, it was also a time of unprecedented opportunity. The social mobility that emerged from this period was a direct, if unintended, consequence of the immense loss of life. In the end, Bartholomew's story is not about the grand, sweeping narratives of history, but about the quiet resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable change. He did not lead an army or discover a new continent. His struggle was a far more intimate one, the fight to rebuild a life and a business in a world that had become unrecognizable. He was a survivor of a global catastrophe who found a way to thrive, not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future. His humble ledger book, once a record of a dying world, became a chronicle of a new one, a new weave of society, where a simple cloth merchant had a small, but significant, role to play. The legacy of the Black Death, and of people like Bartholomew, is a testament to how even the most mundane aspects of our lives, our work, our networks, our daily routines, are profoundly interconnected with the grand tapestry of history. The Great Pestilence did not just kill, it forced a world to be reborn, leading to a new social order, the end of serfdom in many places, and a foundation for a modern economy. The thread that was unraveled was not simply retied, it was rewoven into a stronger, more complex fabric. The next time you look at a piece of cloth, consider the journey it took and the countless, untold stories of the people who made it, for in those quiet details lies the true story of our past. The weight of a single solidus, the gold coin that was the bedrock of the Byzantine Empire's economy, was not just a measure of currency, it was a measure of a man's worth, his livelihood, and his place in the sprawling, bureaucratic machine of the Eastern Roman Empire. For Nicetas, an imperial tax collector in the city of Ephesus in the 6th century AD, this weight was a constant, almost physical presence. He was not a legionary fighting a barbarian horde or an emperor issuing decrees from the Grand Palace in Constantinople. His battlefield was the dusty streets of his city, his weapon a heavy ledger, and his constant enemy was the subtle, persistent human desire to avoid paying one's due. His job, in its essence, was the most mundane yet vital of all imperial functions, to ensure that the wealth of the empire, from the humble fisherman's catch to the silk merchant's profit, flowed ceaselessly into the coffers of the state. You, in a world of digital transactions and automated payroll deductions, cannot fully appreciate the sheer logistical and administrative complexity of tax collection in the ancient world. The Byzantine Empire, stretching from the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to the windswept plains of Anatolia, was held together not by military might alone, but by a meticulously organized system of taxation. Every year, Nicetas and his fellow triers, or collectors, would receive a detailed indition, a tax assessment based on land ownership, crop yields, and the number of laborers in a household. This was not a simple task. Land ownership was often murky, with a single plot of land having multiple claimants. Crop yields were at the mercy of the fickle gods of weather, and the number of laborers could change from season to season. The process was a painstaking exercise in data collection and meticulous record keeping, conducted with no more advanced technology than a quill, an inkwell, and a papyrus scroll. Nicetas's days were a monotonous procession of visits to farms, workshops, and markets. He wasn't a feared enforcer, not at first. His approach was one of quiet persistence and detailed verification. He would arrive at a farm and spend hours with the farmer, meticulously measuring the fields, counting the olive trees, and estimating the expected yield of grain. He had to be part botanist, part surveyor, and part psychologist. He had to listen to the farmer's tales of a bad harvest, of a field that was less fertile this year than the last, and he had to discern truth from calculated exaggeration. He carried with him a series of ledgers, each one a masterwork of bureaucratic art, filled with columns and rows for different types of taxes, the capitatio, a head tax, the jugatio, a land tax, and the various duties on trade and commerce. The sheer variety of taxes was staggering. There were taxes on the consumption of goods, on the inheritance of property, and on the use of public resources. There were special taxes for maintaining roads and aqueducts, and levies for the upkeep of the imperial army. This wasn't a simple income tax, it was a patchwork quilt of financial obligations, each one a tiny thread in the vast economic fabric of the empire. Nicetas's job was to ensure that every thread was accounted for. He was a human auditor, and his life was a never-ending cycle of counting, weighing, and measuring. The most frustrating part of his job was not the dishonesty of the citizens, though that was a constant irritant, but the sheer inefficiency of the system. The assessments were often based on outdated information, and the process of collecting and transporting the revenue was a logistical nightmare. The most valuable tax was the annona, a tax paid in kind, usually in grain. This was the tax that fed the armies and the urban populations, and its collection was a matter of national security. Imagine the logistics, collecting thousands of tons of grain from scattered farms, storing it in vast granaries, and then transporting it, often across hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain, to the great cities and military outposts. The grain was not just a commodity, it was the lifeblood of the empire, and Nicetas was one of the many arteries through which it flowed. He was part of a vast, interconnected network of civil servants, from the assessors who determined the tax burden to the treasury officials who received the final payment. This silent, unglamorous work was the true foundation of the Byzantine Empire's longevity. While empires to the west crumbled under the weight of barbarian invasions and political instability, the Byzantine state endured, a testament to its efficient, if at times oppressive, tax collection system. Nicetas understood that his work was not about avarice, it was about order. It was about ensuring that the lamps of civilization did not go out. The aqueducts did not repair themselves. The walls of the city did not stand without maintenance. The Roman army, a constant shield against the encroaching darkness, did not march on empty stomachs. His quiet, painstaking work was the mortar between the bricks of the empire. He was an unsung hero, not of the battlefield, but of the balance sheet. He was a bureaucrat, a civil servant, a keeper of records, and in his tireless, methodical work lay the secret to the empire's survival. However, as the empire began to face new threats, both internal and external, the tax collection system, once a source of strength, began to show its flaws. Corruption, inefficiency, and the immense pressure of raising funds for constant warfare began to strain the very fabric of the state. How could a man like Nicetas, a quiet functionary, navigate a system that was becoming increasingly desperate and ruthless, and what would happen when the burden of taxation became too heavy for the ordinary citizen to bear? The relative peace and order that had defined Nicetas's early career began to dissolve in the face of the growing pressures on the Byzantine state. The year 542 AD brought with it a catastrophe far greater than any barbarian raid, the arrival of the Justinianic plague. You, a person who lives in an era of global health organizations and rapid medical response, must imagine a world where such an event was not just a sickness, but a complete societal and economic collapse. For Nicetas, the plague was not a single event, but a slow, creeping rot that worked its way through the very fabric of his tax collection system. The first sign was the death of his assistant, a young man who had a knack for numbers and a family that depended on him. Then came the empty houses, the fields left untended, and the workshops that had fallen silent. The tax base, the very foundation of the empire's fiscal health, was quite literally dying. The imperial edict from Constantinople was swift and brutal. The tax quotas would not be lowered. The emperor, Justinian I, was engaged in a costly war to reconquer the Western Roman Empire and could not afford a shortfall in revenue. This decision put Nicetas and his fellow tax collectors in an impossible position. Their meticulous ledgers, once a source of pride, now served as a grim record of a population that no longer existed. He was tasked with collecting taxes from the dead, with demanding money from families that had been wiped out by the plague, and with enforcing a quota that was no longer economically or morally feasible. The quiet, bureaucratic life of a civil servant had been transformed into the harrowing, morally ambiguous life of a debt collector for a ghost empire. The pressure was immense. Nicetas was no longer a quiet fact-finder, he was an agent of a desperate state. He was forced to become more aggressive, to use threats and coercion to extract what little wealth remained in his jurisdiction. He saw the shift in the eyes of the people he had once dealt with on a first-name basis. The fear was no longer of the plague, but of the tax collector. The farmers who had once brought him fresh produce as a small token of gratitude now met his arrival with suspicion and hostility. He had to decide, on a daily basis, who to press and who to let go, knowing that the wrong decision could either lead to his own punishment for a shortfall in revenue or to the complete ruin of a family. He was a man caught between the ruthless demands of an empire and the desperate plight of its citizens. The burden of the ledger became a tangible weight on his shoulders. He would spend his nights poring over the scrolls, trying to find a solution that did not exist. The numbers did not lie. He could see the deficit growing, a black mark that threatened to engulf him. He tried to appeal to his superiors, to explain that the indition was now wildly out of step with the reality on the ground. His pleas fell on deaf ears. The imperial bureaucracy was a vast, impersonal machine, and a single tax collector's protest was a mere whisper against the grinding gears of state policy. This was the true nature of power in the Byzantine world. Not the glamorous life of emperors and generals, but the faceless, relentless pressure of a system that demanded compliance above all else. The story of the Justinianic plague, from the perspective of a tax collector, is a story about the breaking point of a system. It is a chronicle of how a tool of order and stability can, under immense duress, become an instrument of oppression. The tax collection system, once a source of imperial strength, was now a source of deep resentment and instability. The people, who had endured the plague with a quiet resignation, now had to face the possibility of starvation and ruin at the hands of their own government. This was the dark underbelly of a great empire, the point where the needs of the state overwhelmed the needs of its people. Nicetas was forced to make a choice. He could continue to enforce a policy that was destroying the lives of his neighbors and, in the process, guaranteeing his own survival within the system. Or he could find a way to subvert the system, to use his quiet position to offer some form of relief, even if it meant risking his career and his life. What could a single, insignificant bureaucrat do to bend the will of an empire? In a world where the system was failing and a single life was worth less than a few solidi in a tax ledger, Nicetas made a quiet, courageous decision. He chose to subvert the bureaucracy from within. His rebellion was not a grand, dramatic act of defiance, but a series of small, painstaking changes to his accounting practices. It was a rebellion of the quill and the papyrus scroll, a silent war waged against the unbending logic of a desperate empire. He could not erase the tax rolls, but he could change the way they were interpreted. He began to apply what he called the plague factor to his assessments, a silent, unwritten rule that reduced the tax burden of the surviving families based on the number of their deceased members. He would spend his evenings, not just tallying numbers, but meticulously cross-referencing death records with tax assessments, a grim and lonely task that transformed his work from a simple duty into an act of compassion. His method was simple but risky. He would intentionally underreport the assessed value of properties and the number of living laborers. When he collected the annona, he would record a smaller amount of grain, secretly siphoning off a portion to distribute to the neediest families. He became a kind of Robin Hood of the Byzantine tax system, a faceless benefactor who operated under the very nose of the imperial bureaucracy. He was risking not just his job, but his life, for corruption in the Byzantine system was not a matter of a few years in prison, it was a matter of being stripped of all possessions and exiled, or worse. He had to maintain a delicate balance, collecting just enough to avoid arousing suspicion from his superiors, while at the same time alleviating the immense suffering of the people he served. His life was a constant, low-level anxiety, a tightrope walk between duty and humanity. Nicetas's story is a profound example of how individual action can impact the grand tapestry of history, even in a system that seems to crush the individual spirit. He was not a king or a general, but his quiet act of defiance helped to save his community from complete economic collapse. The taxes he misplaced, and the assessments he miscalculated, were not lost. They were reinvested directly into the local economy, allowing families to survive, to replant their fields, and to slowly begin the long process of rebuilding their lives. While the empire as a whole was weakened by the plague and its subsequent fiscal policies, the region under Nicetas's subtle protection was able to recover more quickly. The seeds of a local, grassroots economy, fueled by his secret accounting, were being sown. In the end, Nicetas's legacy was not in the great halls of Constantinople or in the official records of the empire. His legacy was in the lives he saved, in the children who survived starvation because he had managed to secure a few extra bushels of grain, and in the families who were able to hold on to their land because he had quietly reduced their tax burden. He was a testament to the idea that even in the most rigid and unyielding of systems, there is always room for human compassion and moral courage. His story shows us that the true strength of an empire is not in its military might or its vast wealth, but in the small, quiet acts of kindness and resilience performed by its most ordinary citizens. The long, complicated history of Roman tax collection, from the meticulous ledgers of a well-organized state to the ruthless demands of a desperate one, ultimately reveals a truth about the nature of power. Systems, no matter how grand, are ultimately run by people. The decisions of an emperor may set the course of history, but the daily actions of countless, unsung individuals, like a tax collector named Nicetas, are what determine its ultimate outcome. His quiet rebellion shows us that the history of an empire is not just a story of its triumphs and failures, but also a story of its humanity. The rhythm of the Roman Empire was not the thunder of marching legions or the clamor of political debate in the Forum. Its true heartbeat was the quiet, constant work of men like Quintus, a strader or road builder, in the province of Britannia in the late 2nd century AD. For Quintus, the glory of Rome was not an abstract concept but a tangible, physical reality measured in the painstaking process of laying a foundation, one stone at a time. The famous Roman roads, those arteries of empire that stretched from the sands of Syria to the misty highlands of Britain, did not build themselves. They were the product of unglamorous, backbreaking labor, a testament to the fact that the greatness of a civilization often rests on the most boring and enduring of its achievements. You, in a world of asphalt and concrete, cannot fully comprehend the sheer scale and ingenuity of the Roman road system. It was a marvel of civil engineering, a complex network designed not for speed, but for durability and permanence. The process of building a road began with the careful surveying of the land, a task performed by a grammaticus, a land surveyor, who used a tool called a groma to ensure a perfectly straight line. Quintus's role began after this initial stage. His work was about the earth itself, digging deep ditches to create a solid foundation, filling them with layers of carefully selected materials, and then compacting it all into a surface that would last for centuries. This was not a job for the faint of heart. It was a test of physical endurance, a battle against mud, rain, and the sheer weight of the stones. The construction of a Roman road was a multi-layered process, a kind of geological lasagna that provided both stability and drainage. The first layer, the pavimentum, was a bed of sand or mortar. This was followed by a layer of large, flat stones, the statumen, laid in mortar or clay. The third layer, the rudus, was a thick blanket of concrete, often made from crushed brick or pottery. Finally, the top layer, the summum dorsum, was a carefully laid surface of cobblestones or gravel, designed to be slightly domed to allow water to run off the sides. Each layer was a solution to a problem, a testament to a pragmatic, problem-solving mindset that valued functionality above all else. Quintus's daily life was a repetitive cycle of digging, lifting, and compacting. His tools were simple: a pickaxe, a shovel, a handcart, and a heavy wooden ramming tool for compacting the layers. He was part of a small team, a collegium, of road builders, each member with a specific role. The work was slow, methodical, and rarely celebrated. He knew that the road he was building was not just a path for marching soldiers, it was a conduit for trade, a lifeline for communities, and a physical manifestation of Rome's dominion. The silk from the east, the grain from Africa, the pottery from Gaul, all of it moved along these meticulously constructed arteries. The road was the silent engine of the Roman economy. The maintenance of these roads was perhaps even more important than their initial construction. Rome understood that a road, left to the mercy of time and weather, would inevitably fall into disrepair. The straightors were not just builders, they were also a kind of mobile repair crew, constantly traveling their assigned routes to fill potholes, replace broken stones, and clear away debris. This was a perpetual, low-level battle against entropy, a quiet war waged on behalf of the Roman state. The success of this system lay in its continuity and consistency. A single broken cobblestone might seem insignificant, but 100 broken cobblestones could make a road impassable, and 1,000 could lead to the collapse of a trade route, and with it, the stability of an entire region. Quintus's work was the true foundation of Roman power. It was not the grand speeches in the Senate or the victories of the legions, but the quiet, unyielding commitment to building and maintaining the infrastructure that held the empire together. He was a small, almost invisible part of a vast machine, a nameless contributor to a legacy that would outlast the empire itself. He would go to his grave having done nothing spectacular, but having contributed to one of the most significant and enduring achievements in human history. Yet, this meticulously planned system had a weakness. It relied entirely on the uninterrupted flow of labor, materials, and funds from a central authority. What would happen when that authority began to weaken? How would a man like Quintus continue his work when the support system, the very foundation of his life's work, began to crumble under the weight of a slow and quiet decline? The slow decline of the Western Roman Empire was not a single, dramatic collapse. For a man like Quintus, it was a gradual decay, a series of small, almost imperceptible cracks appearing in the once perfect pavement of the Roman road system. The year is now the early 4th century AD, and the constant, methodical flow of resources from the imperial center had begun to falter. You, who live in a world of complex global economies and supply chains, would find this breakdown a subtle yet terrifying phenomenon. For Quintus, the signs were all too real. The quarries that had once supplied a steady stream of limestone and basalt were now operating at a reduced capacity. The soldiers who once provided labor for the largest construction projects were now needed on the frontiers to fight off a growing number of barbarian raids. The well-oiled machine of imperial bureaucracy was beginning to seize up, and the first to feel it were the men on the ground. Quintus's daily routine was now a source of mounting frustration. Orders for new projects arrived with less frequency, and when they did, the materials and manpower were rarely sufficient. He was often left to patch and repair with whatever he could find, a temporary fix on a road that had been designed for permanence. The Straightors were no longer a well-funded, organized force. They were a collection of local artisans and former soldiers, each doing what they could with what they had. The once uniform quality of the Roman roads began to vary wildly, from a well-maintained section near a military camp to a rutted, impassable mess just a few miles down the line. The network was becoming a patchwork, a testament to the fact that without consistent maintenance, even the most enduring of human creations will eventually crumble. The social fabric of the empire was also fraying. The constant wars and plagues had depleted the population, leading to a severe labor shortage. The landowning elite, in an effort to secure workers for their estates, were using their influence to divert manpower away from public works projects like road repair. Quintus saw the once proud sense of civic duty being replaced by a more desperate, survivalist mentality. His work, once a source of pride, now felt like a lonely, futile battle against an irresistible tide. The roads, once symbols of Roman strength and unity, were becoming a metaphor for the empire itself, a magnificent structure in a slow state of disrepair. The most difficult challenge for Quintus was the loss of communication. The reliable cursus publicus, the Roman postal and transport service, was becoming unreliable. Messages from the provincial capital, once delivered with clockwork precision, now arrived weeks late, or not at all. This lack of centralized command meant that Quintus and his team were forced to make decisions on their own, often without the necessary funds or resources. They became a kind of independent militia, fixing what they could, when they could, with whatever they could scrounge. The grand, unified vision of the Roman road system was giving way to a localized, chaotic reality, a world where survival depended on one's own wits rather than on the might of the state. This slow decay was a far greater threat than any barbarian army. An invading army could be defeated, but the silent, creeping rot of neglect was a more insidious enemy. It eroded the very foundation of the Roman state, making it harder to move troops to a crisis, to collect taxes from distant provinces, and to trade goods that were essential for the urban population. The empire was not collapsing from a single blow, but from 1,000 small failures, each one a crack in the pavement. Quintus, a man whose life had been dedicated to the mundane yet vital task of building and maintaining roads, was now forced to confront the possibility that his life's work would simply be abandoned. He had seen empires rise and fall in his history scrolls, but he had never imagined that the great roads of Rome, the very lifeblood of civilization, could simply be left to the mercy of the elements. What could one man do in the face of such a colossal and systemic failure? How could a single Strator continue to build and repair when the empire itself was no longer providing the tools? The final act of Quintus's story is a profound lesson in the nature of resilience and the subtle shift of power from the imperial to the local. With the central authority in Rome failing, the grand, unified vision for the road system died. But the need for roads did not. In the face of imperial neglect, Quintus and his colleagues did not simply abandon their work. Instead, they adapted. Their focus shifted from maintaining a vast, interconnected network to preserving the vital arteries of their own communities. The roads they built and maintained were no longer for the legions or the emperor's couriers, they were for the local farmers, the merchants who needed to get their goods to market, and the families who needed to visit their relatives in a neighboring village. This was the moment when the unsung architects truly came into their own. Quintus, once a small cog in a large machine, became a community leader. He and his team of road builders began to work directly with the local landowners and village elders. The old system of imperial taxes and centralized funding was replaced by a more direct, community-based model. Landowners would contribute labor from their estates, and merchants would offer a portion of their profits to fund the repairs. It was a chaotic, ad hoc system, a far cry from the meticulous bureaucracy of old Rome, but it was a system born of necessity and it worked. The roads that connected the key towns and farms in Quintus's region remained functional, while the great arteries that once spanned the empire fell into disrepair. The Roman road system, in essence, did not die, it simply decentralized. This shift was a harbinger of the medieval world to come, a world of localized power and fragmented authority. The grand, unified vision of the empire was replaced by the pragmatic, survival-oriented ethos of the local community. The roads themselves became a physical manifestation of this change. The expertly laid Roman stone of the main routes began to be overgrown with weeds and grass, while the side roads, the local arteries, were patched with whatever materials were available, often less durable, but no less functional for their purpose. This was not a story of a glorious triumph, but a quiet, almost sad conclusion to a magnificent achievement. The roads, once a symbol of imperial strength, became a testament to the quiet endurance of ordinary people. Quintus's legacy was not a monument or a historical record in a dusty archive. His legacy was the persistence of a single road that continued to connect two villages, a path that allowed a local market to survive, or a route that enabled a family to escape a sudden crisis. He and his colleagues, the unsung architects of a dying empire, demonstrated that the true strength of a civilization lies not in its grand pronouncements, but in its ability to adapt and survive at the most local level. The Roman roads, in their slow and quiet decay, tell a story of a system that was too rigid to survive a changing world, but also of the human spirit that was flexible and resilient enough to build a new one. The next time you see a crumbling ancient ruin or a section of a Roman road, remember that its history is not just about the emperors and the legions. It is also about the quiet, uncelebrated work of men like Quintus, the road builders who, one pebble at a time, laid the very foundations of the world we know today. Their story reminds us that even the most mundane jobs can be a profound testament to the resilience and enduring legacy of our past. The fertile south, cedar from the Levant, and stone from the quarries, was the very circulatory system of the kingdom. Khufu's job was to be the vigilant record-keeper of this system. He worked in a small, mud-brick office at a bustling dock on the edge of Thebes, the air thick with the smell of river water, dust, and the faint, earthy scent of grain. His tools were a simple palette of red and black ink, a water pot, and a set of carefully sharpened reed pens. The process of documenting a shipment was a meticulous, multi-step affair. A barge would arrive, heavy in the water, its crew exhausted from a long journey. Khufu would step onto the swaying deck, a small, unassuming figure amidst a chaotic flurry of activity. He would have to identify the cargo, which was often a challenge. A single barge might carry dozens of different items, pottery filled with oil, sacks of wheat, bundles of linen, and even live animals destined for the royal estates. He had to count each item, assess its condition, and record it all in a language understood only by a select few. The hieroglyphs he wrote were not just symbols, they were data points in a vast, interconnected network of commerce. A broken pot, a torn sack, each detail had to be noted, for it could mean the difference between profit and loss for a distant merchant. The shipping manifest, or chasseur, was more than just a list of goods. It was a legal document, a bill of lading that served as proof of a transaction and a record for tax collection. Every grain of wheat, every cubit of linen, was subject to a royal tax, and Khufu's records were the ultimate authority. His work was a quiet act of immense power. He was the guardian of the kingdom's fiscal health, an invisible hand that ensured the pharaoh's granaries were full and the royal treasury remained solvent. The stability of a kingdom, a reality that seems so distant and grand, was built on the quiet diligence of a man who spent his days counting sacks of grain. Khufu was an anomaly in ancient Egyptian society. A chasseur was a person of high status, one of the few who were literate in a society of peasants and manual laborers. He lived a life of relative comfort, free from the backbreaking toil of the fields or the quarries. His power came not from physical strength, but from his knowledge, a knowledge that was passed down through generations of scribes in the secretive schools of the temples. He was a keeper of secrets, a master of a language that governed the kingdom's economy and social structure. Yet, this system, so seemingly perfect and unchangeable, had a weakness. It relied entirely on the uninterrupted flow of goods and information, a reliance that was about to be tested. As the kingdom entered an era of political instability and foreign invasion, the quiet, predictable rhythm of the Nile trade began to falter. What would happen to the world of a scribe like Khufu when the very fabric of the kingdom, the stable, bureaucratic system he had dedicated his life to, began to unravel? And how would a man whose power was based on meticulous record-keeping survive in a world where chaos and disruption became the new normal? The quiet, predictable life of Khufu was shattered by the political turmoil that began to plague Egypt in the late 13th century BC. The pharaohs, once powerful and absolute, were now facing internal rebellion and a growing threat from the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders whose origins and intentions were a source of constant dread. You, who are used to a world where governments are stable and borders are clearly defined, cannot imagine the psychological and logistical impact of such a long, slow-burning crisis. For Khufu, the first signs were not the clash of armies, but the disruption of the one thing that had always been a constant, the flow of barges on the Nile. The once thrumming docks became a place of anxious anticipation. Barges were delayed, their arrival dates becoming a matter of guesswork rather than a reliable certainty. The goods that did arrive were often damaged, and the crews that delivered them were exhausted and full of unsettling rumors of coastal towns put to the torch. The carefully maintained system of commerce was beginning to break down. Merchants, fearing the loss of their cargo to raids, began to hoard goods. Farmers, unsure of the future, started to plant less and hold on to what they had. The apathetic and efficient bureaucracy of the state, which had always relied on a steady stream of revenue, was now forced to deal with a severe shortfall. The pharaoh's demands for taxes remained constant, but the resources to pay them were dwindling. This put Khufu in a precarious position. He was a man of the ledger, a keeper of the records, but the records he was now being asked to create were a fiction. He was under immense pressure from his superiors to report a consistent level of tax collection, even as the trade itself was collapsing. He was forced to make a difficult choice between being a loyal civil servant and being an honest record keeper. The barge he was inspecting, a vessel once filled with the promise of prosperity, was now a symbol of this systemic failure. Its hull was damaged, its cargo of fine linens and pottery was waterlogged, and its crew was surly and defensive. Khufu had to document the losses, a task that was not just about accounting but about the very human experience of ruin and despair. He knew that if he reported the true extent of the damage, the merchant who owned the cargo would be ruined. But if he lied, he would be betraying the system he had dedicated his life to. His silent, unglamorous profession had suddenly become a stage for a profound moral drama, one that was playing out in every corner of the crumbling empire. This was the true face of the decline of a great civilization. It was not a single, decisive battle or the fall of a capital city. It was the slow, quiet erosion of trust, of the small, unspoken agreements that make a society function. The scribes, the unsung heroes of the empire, were now the first to feel the pressure of its decay. They were the ones who had to reconcile the glorious, unchanging image of the pharaoh's power with the grim reality on the ground. Khufu's reed pen, once a tool of order, now felt like an instrument of a silent, creeping lie. He began to notice that he was not alone in his predicament. The scribes at other docks and granaries were facing the same impossible dilemma. Some chose to look the other way, forging documents and hiding the truth from their superiors. Others, clinging to their sense of duty, reported the reality and faced the wrath of a state that did not want to hear bad news. This was the moment when the silent fraternity of scribes, the guardians of the kingdom's information, had to make a choice between their own survival and the integrity of their profession. As Khufu tallied the final, devastating losses of the latest barge, he had to confront a terrifying question. What happens when the truth becomes a liability? And what could a man whose only power was the truth do in a world that had no use for it anymore? The ultimate challenge for Khufu was to find a new purpose in a world where his old one had become meaningless. The meticulous, fact-based system he had served for decades had broken down, and the grand, glorious narrative of the pharaoh's power was no longer a reflection of reality. You, a person who understands the power of information in both its truth and its falsity, must appreciate the profound dilemma this presented. Khufu chose a path of quiet, personal rebellion, a rebellion not against the system, but for the very soul of his profession. He could no longer be a chronicler of the state's might, so he decided to become a chronicler of his people's endurance. He began to keep a second, secret set of ledgers. While the official manifests he submitted to his superiors were carefully crafted fictions, designed to maintain the illusion of a functioning economy, his private scrolls were a testament to the truth. In these secret documents, he recorded the true extent of the losses, the names of the merchants who had been ruined, and the types of goods that were no longer flowing on the Nile. He meticulously documented the stories of the families who had lost their farms to tax collectors, the villages that had been sacked by raiders, and the quiet acts of resilience that allowed people to survive. This was not a document of state, but a document of humanity. His new work was not about power, but about remembrance. This quiet, personal act of resistance was not without its risks. The very act of keeping a separate, truthful record was a treasonous act in a system that valued the illusion of stability over the messy reality of decline. But for Khufu, it was a matter of professional integrity. He was a scribe, a man whose life's work was the truth, and he could not abide the idea of his skills being used to perpetuate a lie. He understood that the history of an empire is not just told in its official edicts and grand monuments, but also in the quiet, unrecorded moments of its people. His papyrus scrolls, filled with the mundane tragedies and triumphs of ordinary Egyptians, were a more honest and enduring monument than any pyramid. In the end, the official records of the late 13th century BC Egypt tell a story of a gradual, but manageable, decline. They speak of a stable government, a resilient economy, and a pharaoh who maintained control. But the private records of men like Khufu, hidden in the mud brick walls of a small office on the edge of the Nile, tell a very different story. They tell a story of a civilization that was not dying, but transforming, a story of how a seemingly perfect system can be hollowed out from within by the realities of a changing world. Khufu's act reminds us that the power of a single document, and a single human heart, can be a profound force for truth. The history of ancient Egypt, in all its complexity, is not just about the grand, glorious narratives we see in museums. It is also about the quiet, persistent work of countless, unsung individuals who, one hieroglyph at a time, wrote the true story of their time. The next time you see a papyrus scroll, imagine the human hand that held the pen, and the profound, and often painful, truth that it was recording. For in those boring details lies the real history of a civilization. The popular imagination paints the so-called Dark Ages as a time of unlettered barbarism, a period when the light of knowledge was extinguished by ignorance and war. But this narrative overlooks the quiet, persistent work of men like Brother Thomas, a scriptor or scribe, in the scriptorium of a remote monastery in what is now modern-day Ireland in the 9th century AD. His world was not one of great battles or political intrigues. It was a world defined by the soft, rhythmic scratching of his quill, the faint, sweet scent of vellum, and the methodical, almost hypnotic work of copying and preserving the great texts of antiquity. This was the true history of the era, a silent, unglamorous battle to keep the flame of knowledge from flickering out entirely. You, in a world where information is instantly accessible on a glowing screen, cannot grasp the immense effort involved in creating a single book. The process was a logistical and intellectual marvel, a testament to the dedication of men who saw their work as a form of worship. The scriptorium, the heart of the monastery, was a silent, unheated room, its windows letting in the weak, diffused light of the northern sun. Here, Brother Thomas and his fellow scribes worked from dawn to dusk, their breath clouding in the cold air. His primary tools were a razor-sharp knife for preparing the vellum, a ruler for lining the pages, and a meticulously crafted goose quill. The ink was a mixture of lampblack, gum, and water, a recipe that had been passed down through generations. The entire process was a kind of prayer, a meditation on the beauty and power of the written word. The creation of a single manuscript was a multi-stage process that required a surprising level of administrative planning. The first step was the preparation of the vellum, a material made from animal hide that was stretched, scraped, and treated until it was smooth and almost translucent. It took dozens of hides to create a single Bible, and the process was so time-consuming and labor-intensive that a well-prepared stack of vellum was a monastery's most valuable asset. The next step was the work of the librarius, who would select the text to be copied and prepare the blank pages. Then came the scriptor like Brother Thomas, whose job was the careful, painstaking act of copying. He was not a creative artist, he was a human photocopier, and his value lay in his accuracy and consistency. He had to be a master of orthography and grammar, and a single mistake could ruin a week's worth of work. The logistical challenges were immense. A monastery had to be entirely self-sufficient, producing its own ink, its own vellum, and its own food. It was a closed ecosystem of intellectual and physical labor. The preservation of texts was not just an intellectual pursuit, it was a physical one, a battle against time, moisture, and the ever-present threat of fire. The books they created were not just objects, they were the living memory of a civilization, the last remaining link to the great philosophers, poets, and historians of the ancient world. Brother Thomas and his colleagues were the quiet librarians of a dying age, their work a desperate attempt to save the knowledge of the past for a future they might never see. His days were a monotonous cycle of silence and focus. He knew the texts he was copying by heart, but he never allowed his mind to wander. Every letter, every word, every punctuation mark was a matter of immense importance. He saw his work not as a chore, but as a sacred duty, a way to pass on the torch of learning to the generations that would come after him. He was a silent, unsung hero of the Dark Ages, a man who, with a single quill, was fighting a quiet war against the forces of ignorance and oblivion. However, this monastic system, for all its dedication and purpose, had a fundamental flaw. It was an island in a sea of chaos. It was dependent on the very world it sought to escape, a world of war, famine, and political instability that threatened to breach its walls at any moment. What would happen to the world of a scribe like Brother Thomas when the very forces he was trying to hold at bay came knocking on his monastery's door? And how could a man whose only weapon was a quill survive a world where strength was measured in steel and fury? The quiet, predictable world of Brother Thomas and his scriptorium was not immune to the chaos of the outside world. The sound that broke the silence was not the clatter of a quill or the turning of a page, but the distant, mournful wail of a horn, the unmistakable sign of a Viking longship approaching. You, a person who understands the quiet terror of an encroaching crisis, must imagine the paralyzing fear this sound would have evoked. The monastery, a place of peace and contemplation, was suddenly transformed into a fortress, a target for the very forces of disruption that its inhabitants had sought to escape. The Vikings were not interested in the spiritual texts of the monks, they were interested in their worldly possessions, the gold and silver of their chalices, the food in their storehouses, and the valuable vellum and ink in their scriptorium. The monastic life, once a bastion of peace, was now a precarious existence on the front lines of a new, terrifying reality. The meticulous daily routines that had defined their lives were abandoned in a flurry of desperate preparation. The monks, men of God and learning, had to become men of action. They had to hide their most valuable treasures, the illuminated manuscripts and the reliquaries, in secret caches buried in the ground or hidden in the monastery's many nooks and crannies. Brother Thomas, a man whose hands were accustomed to the delicate work of a quill, now found himself carrying heavy bundles of vellum and hoisting precious books into hidden lofts. The very objects he had spent his life creating were now the greatest liability. The Viking raids were not just about plunder, they were about the disruption of a system. The Vikings did not just take, they destroyed. The very act of burning a monastery was a symbolic act of defiance against the quiet, intellectual order it represented. For Brother Thomas, this was a profound, almost personal violation. The books he had copied were not just objects, they were the embodiment of human thought, a direct link to the great minds of the past. To see them destroyed was to see a piece of history itself disappear forever. This was the true terror of the Dark Ages, the potential for a complete and utter cultural amnesia. The monastery was not an armed fortress. Its primary defense was its remoteness and its perceived lack of valuable material possessions. But as the raids became more frequent, and the Vikings became more organized, this defense proved to be insufficient. The monks had to face a terrifying reality: their quiet, scholarly life was no longer sustainable in a world where brute force was the only currency that mattered. Their work, once seen as a sacred duty, now seemed almost futile in the face of such overwhelming destruction. This was the moment when the Dark Ages lived up to their name. It was not just an absence of light, but a deliberate act of extinguishing it. The meticulous art of the scriptorium, the quiet work of 1,000 scribes like Brother Thomas, was under direct attack. The very act of reading and writing, once a source of comfort and purpose, now felt like a dangerous luxury. What could a man of books and ink do in a world ruled by fire and steel? And what would become of all the knowledge they had so painstakingly preserved if the monks themselves were wiped out? The story of Brother Thomas and his fellow scribes concludes not in a fiery blaze of martyrdom, but in the quiet, enduring resilience of a community. The Viking raids, for all their terror and destruction, did not succeed in extinguishing the flame of knowledge. Instead, they forced the monastic orders to evolve and to adapt. The monks learned a grim new kind of logistics, the art of preservation in the face of annihilation. Their final act of defiance was not to fight, but to hide. They became a generation of intellectual hoarders, men who saw their greatest duty as the protection of the written word from the forces that sought to destroy it. You, who can back up your entire digital library on a cloud server, must imagine the weight of this responsibility. The monks' scriptorium was no longer a place for new creations, but a fortress for old ones. They began to use a new, more durable kind of script called Carolingian minuscule, a clear, legible script that was easier to copy and less prone to error than the intricate, almost indecipherable scripts of old. This was a pragmatic choice, a recognition that the immediate goal was not elegance, but survival. They were not writing for beauty, but for posterity. They packed their most precious manuscripts into lead-lined boxes, waterproofed them with beeswax, and buried them in the earth, creating a network of secret libraries that lay silent and hidden for centuries. This was the true legacy of the Dark Ages. It was a period of fragmentation and loss, but it was also a period of quiet, uncelebrated preservation. The monks of the Irish monasteries, the silent librarians of a dying world, were not just preserving a few dusty books, they were preserving the very idea of history itself. Their work laid the foundation for the Carolingian Renaissance, a later period of renewed learning and intellectual activity that was built on the very texts they had so painstakingly protected. When Charlemagne's scholars began their work in the 8th century, the manuscripts they were copying and studying were, in many cases, the very ones that had been saved by the quiet dedication of scribes like Brother Thomas. In the end, the candle in the Dark Ages did not go out. It was simply placed in a more secure location, a secret flame tended by the hands of a few dedicated men who understood that the future of a civilization was not in its weapons or its wealth, but in its stories and its knowledge. The Vikings, for all their might, were ultimately a passing storm. The knowledge that the monks preserved in silence would outlast them all. The story of the medieval monastery is a testament to the idea that the most profound acts of resistance are often not the loudest. They are the quiet, painstaking acts of preservation, the small, boring details of a life dedicated to a cause greater than oneself. The next time you see a beautifully illuminated medieval manuscript, remember the scent of parchment, the soft scratch of a quill, and the silent courage of the men who risked everything to ensure that the light of knowledge would one day shine again. The majestic Roman aqueducts, those seemingly indestructible arches of stone that strode across the landscape, were not a symbol of engineering genius alone. They were a testament to the unglamorous, constant work of men like Marcus, a fistulator, or lead pipe fitter, in the city of Rome in the 1st century AD. His world was not one of grand construction projects, but of small, repetitive tasks, the soft clatter of his lead hammer, the hiss of a heated joint, and the meticulous, painstaking work of ensuring that the city's vast water supply flowed without interruption. The grandeur of the aqueducts was nothing without the silent, invisible work of the plumbers who kept them running, a truth often lost in the romanticized view of Roman history. You, who turn on a tap and expect clean water to flow instantly, cannot comprehend the immense logistical and administrative complexity of providing water to 1 million people in the ancient world. The Roman water system was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, a vast network of aqueducts, pipes, and public fountains that was far more sophisticated than anything that would be built for over 1,000 years. But this system was not self-sustaining. It required a small army of dedicated civil servants to maintain it, and among them, the fistulators were the most vital. Their job was to create and repair the lead pipes that carried water from the aqueducts to the public baths, fountains, and private homes of the wealthy. Marcus's daily life was a series of methodical, almost hypnotic tasks. He worked in a small, cramped workshop filled with the scent of hot lead and the tang of rust. His tools were simple, a brazier for melting lead, a variety of hammers and molds for shaping the pipes, and a set of tongs for handling the molten metal. The lead he worked with was heavy and malleable, and the process of joining one pipe to another was a delicate art. He had to heat the joint to a precise temperature, neither too hot nor too cold, and then fuse the two pieces together with a small, precise seam of molten lead. A single mistake could result in a leak, and a single leak in a complex urban system could lead to a massive waste of water. The logistics of his work were just as challenging as the technical aspects. He had to be a master of supply chain management, ensuring that he had a constant supply of raw lead from the distant mines of Britain and Spain. He had to work closely with the surveyors who laid out the routes for the pipes and with the masons who built the public fountains. His work was a quiet, almost invisible contribution to the public good. He was a silent guardian of the city's health and hygiene, a man who ensured that the great baths of Rome remained a source of communal life and that the public fountains continued to quench the thirst of the masses. The Roman state understood the immense value of this work and placed the fistulators in a guild, or collegium, with special privileges and protections. The great Roman aqueducts may have been built by slaves and soldiers, but they were maintained by skilled artisans like Marcus. His work was a testament to a truth often forgotten: the grandeur of a civilization is not just in its monuments, but in the efficiency and reliability of its most mundane systems. The water that flowed from the aqueducts was not just a utility, it was a symbol of Rome's power and a source of civic pride. The constant, steady flow of water was a sign of a well-ordered society, and the men who ensured that flow were the silent, unsung heroes of that order. However, this system of order had a critical flaw. It was utterly dependent on a continuous supply of resources and a stable political environment. What would happen to the world of a man like Marcus when the very fabric of that stability began to fray? How would a plumber, a man of quiet, methodical work, continue his job when the supply of lead ran dry and the great, unified state that funded his work began to show the first signs of internal decay? The 3rd century AD was not a time of great triumphs for the Roman Empire, but a period of profound instability and chaos known as the crisis of the 3rd century. For a man like Marcus, now older and wiser, this crisis was not an abstract political concept but a tangible, physical reality. The once dependable supply chain that provided him with raw lead from distant mines began to falter. The cost of labor, materials, and transport skyrocketed, a reflection of the hyperinflation that was ravaging the Roman economy. You, who are familiar with the modern concept of economic collapse, would find a strange and disquieting parallel in the life of a Roman plumber. The state, once a reliable source of funds, was no longer able to pay its workers, and the great public works projects were left to crumble. The aqueducts, once the pride of the city, were now showing the first signs of neglect. A small leak in a pipe, once a minor inconvenience, now became a symbol of a greater breakdown. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He had the knowledge and the skill to fix the leaks, but he lacked the necessary materials. The lead mines, once a source of imperial wealth, were now operating at a fraction of their capacity. The soldiers who once provided cheap, organized labor were now needed on the frontiers to fight off the barbarian incursions. The entire system, built on a foundation of centralized power and a stable economy, was failing. The public baths, once a vibrant hub of Roman social life, were becoming less and less reliable, their water supply intermittent and their pools often cold and stagnant. Marcus was forced to become a master of improvisation. He and his fellow fistulators began to scavenge for lead, melting down old pipes and even stripping lead from the roofs of public buildings. This was a direct, physical manifestation of the empire's decay. The silent, meticulous work of maintaining the water system was now a desperate, day-to-day struggle for survival. The lead he was working with was no longer a symbol of Roman might, it was a testament to the empire's decline, a precious and increasingly rare resource that he had to fight for. The social and political climate had also changed dramatically. The collegia, the guilds that once protected the rights and privileges of skilled artisans, were now being used by the state as a tool for forced labor. Marcus and his fellow plumbers were no longer free men who chose their profession, they were a de facto part of the state's desperate attempt to keep the infrastructure from collapsing. They were forced to work for little to no pay, their lives dictated by the needs of a state that could no longer provide for them. The spirit of civic duty that had once defined their work was being replaced by a grim sense of forced obligation. This was the true, unglamorous reality of the Roman collapse. It was not a single, decisive moment, but a slow, quiet erosion of a system that had once seemed indestructible. The great monuments of Rome did not fall overnight, they were simply left to decay, the result of 1,000 small acts of neglect. The story of the Roman aqueducts, from the perspective of a plumber, is a story of a system that was too rigid, too dependent on a centralized authority, to survive a period of immense change. The very thing that had made it so great, its unwavering order and efficiency, was also its greatest weakness. As Marcus struggled to repair a leak in a public fountain with a small, scavenged piece of lead, he had to confront a terrifying question. What happens to the grand legacy of a civilization when its most basic functions can no longer be maintained? And what could a man of quiet, methodical work do in a world that was descending into chaos? The final act of Marcus's story is not about the grand collapse of an empire, but about the quiet, local resilience that emerged in its wake. The great, unified system of Roman aqueducts and plumbing did not disappear entirely. It simply fragmented, its grand imperial purpose replaced by a more pragmatic, community-based one. The central government could no longer fund the maintenance of the city's vast water system, so the responsibility fell to the local landowners and the wealthy citizens who depended on a reliable water supply for their homes and businesses. Marcus, a man whose life had been dedicated to serving the state, found a new purpose serving his community. He and his fellow plumbers formed a new, unofficial guild, a collegium based not on imperial decree but on mutual need. They no longer relied on the distant lead mines of Britain, they became masters of recycling, melting down old statues, lead roofing, and even ancient pipes to create new ones. Their work was less grand, less uniform, but no less vital. The great public baths fell into disrepair, but a reliable, albeit smaller, water supply was maintained for the private homes of the wealthy and for the most essential public fountains. The Roman water system, in essence, did not die, it became a private, localized service, a testament to the fact that when a great system fails, people will always find a way to meet their basic needs. This was a profound shift in the nature of Roman society. The grand, unified vision of a centralized state, where the emperor provided for the needs of the people, was replaced by a more fragmented, self-reliant model. The Roman water system, once a symbol of a powerful, beneficent state, became a symbol of a society that was now fending for itself. The silent, meticulous work of men like Marcus, once an unglamorous part of a larger whole, was now a celebrated and essential service. He was no longer just a plumber, he was a custodian of a civilization's most basic and vital resource. The enduring legacy of the Roman aqueducts is not just in the majestic ruins that dot the landscape, but in the quiet, human story of adaptation and survival. The system of plumbing and water management, which was one of the greatest achievements of the Roman world, was ultimately saved not by the power of the emperor, but by the quiet diligence of a few dedicated men who refused to let it die. Their story reminds us that even in the face of immense change, the most essential functions of a society will find a way to persist, a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. The next time you see a picture of a Roman aqueduct, remember that its history is not just about the grand monuments and the brilliant engineering. It is also about the quiet, uncelebrated work of the plumbers who kept it flowing, one small, melted piece of lead at a time. Their story is a powerful reminder that the true strength of a civilization lies not just in its grandeur, but in its ability to adapt and endure. The grandeur of the Achaemenid Persian Empire was not built on military conquest alone, it was held together by an administrative marvel known as the Royal Road, a network of meticulously maintained highways that spanned over 1,600 miles. For a man like Artabanus, a Pyridatsis or dispatch rider in the 5th century BC, this road was his entire world. His life was not one of glory or high adventure, but a relentless, almost monotonous cycle of riding, changing horses, and passing messages. This was the true engine of the Persian Empire, a system of communication so efficient and reliable that it was the envy of the ancient world. You, in an age of instant emails and text messages, can't fully grasp the immense logistical challenge of communicating across a landmass that stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean Sea. The Persian Empire was a diverse tapestry of languages, cultures, and peoples, and its ability to govern such a vast territory depended entirely on the speed with which the king's orders and intelligence could be relayed. The Royal Road was the physical manifestation of this need. It was a testament to the fact that for a great empire to function, its bureaucracy had to be as fast and as reliable as its army. Artabanus's daily life was a demanding, high-stakes relay race. He was part of a chain of riders, each one responsible for a single leg of the journey. The road was divided into a series of relay stations, known as Pyridatsis, spaced approximately every 15 miles. At each station, there was a fresh horse and a new rider waiting to receive the message. Artabanus's job was to ride his horse at a near gallop for the entire length of his section, delivering his message to the waiting rider at the next station. He did not rest, he did not stop. His purpose was singular, to ensure the message was passed on as quickly as humanly possible. The riders were not just fast, they were a highly trusted and vetted part of the imperial machine. They were chosen for their endurance, their courage, and, most importantly, their loyalty to the king. The messages they carried were often matters of life and death, and the security of the communication was a paramount concern. The messages were often sealed with the royal signet, and Artabanus was trained to protect it with his life. He was a human courier, a silent, fast-moving link in a chain of information that held an entire civilization together. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Messages could travel from the Persian capital of Susa to the city of Sardis, a distance of over 1,600 miles, in as little as 7 days. This was an unprecedented feat of logistics, a testament to the methodical and unglamorous work of 1,000 men like Artabanus. They were the silent architects of the empire, the men who ensured that the king's will was known and carried out in the farthest reaches of his domain. The road was their battlefield, their horse their weapon, and their endurance their shield. The famous quote from Herodotus, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds," was a direct reference to these men. Yet, for all its efficiency and grandeur, this system had a fundamental vulnerability. It was entirely dependent on a stable, secure political environment. What would happen to the world of a man like Artabanus when the very foundations of the empire, the king's authority and the stability of the road itself, began to waver? And how would a man whose entire purpose was to move quickly and efficiently survive in a world where chaos and disruption became the new normal? The well-oiled machine of the Achaemenid Empire began to show its age, and for Artabanus, this decline was not a matter of politics or philosophy but a tangible, physical reality. The once dependable royal road was becoming a less traveled, more dangerous place. You, who are used to the security and predictability of modern infrastructure, must imagine the psychological toll of this gradual decay. The stations, once bustling hubs of activity with fresh horses and well-rested riders, were now often deserted. The once clear, well-maintained road was now rutted and overgrown, a silent testament to a state that could no longer afford to maintain its own arteries. The source of this decline was a series of costly wars and internal rebellions that drained the empire's coffers and diverted its resources. The central authority, once a guarantor of order, was becoming less and less able to secure the far-flung reaches of its domain. For Artabanus, this meant that his quiet, lonely job had become immeasurably more dangerous. The bandits who once avoided the royal road, knowing it was under the king's protection, now saw it as a rich hunting ground. A rider carrying a royal message was a prize, a symbol of a state that was too weak to protect its own. The loyalty that had once been a source of pride was now a liability. The most profound change, however, was in the messages themselves. The dispatches that Artabanus carried were no longer the confident, well-reasoned orders of a strong king. They were now filled with a sense of desperation, a flurry of panicked commands and desperate pleas for reinforcements. The intelligence he was tasked with delivering was often outdated by the time it reached its destination. The system, once a symbol of speed and efficiency, was now a painful illustration of the empire's inertia. It could not adapt to the new reality of a decentralized and fragmented world. The very speed that had once been its strength now felt like a cruel joke. A message sent at a breakneck pace from a failing capital could do nothing to save a city that had already fallen. This was the true, unglamorous reality of the empire's decline. It was not a single, dramatic moment, but a slow, quiet erosion of a system that had once seemed indestructible. The Pyridoxus, the relay stations that had once symbolized the empire's power, were now falling into disrepair, their supplies running low, their riders fewer in number. The famous couriers of the Persian Empire, the men who had once been the envy of the ancient world, were now a fading memory, their incredible endurance and loyalty serving a state that could no longer sustain them. Artabanus found himself caught in a moral dilemma. He was a man of the road, a professional courier whose entire life was about loyalty and efficiency. But what was the point of his work when the messages he carried were no longer a source of order, but of chaos? How could a man whose identity was tied to the speed of his horse survive in a world where the road itself was becoming a symbol of a slow, inevitable decline? The final act of Artabanus's story is a profound lesson in the power of human endurance and the enduring value of information, even in a world that is falling apart. The great imperial system of the royal road did not last. As the Achaemenid Empire gave way to the conquests of Alexander the Great and his successors, the road itself fell into disrepair. The relay stations, once hubs of activity, were abandoned, their purposes forgotten. But the need for reliable communication, for the quiet, vital work of relaying messages, did not die. It simply decentralized. Artabanus and his fellow couriers did not disappear. Instead, they began to work for local satraps, wealthy landowners, and independent merchants. The speed and efficiency that had once served a great empire were now serving smaller, more resilient local networks. The messages they carried were no longer about the king's grand proclamations, but about the mundane realities of trade, of local politics, and of personal correspondence. The system, once a top-down model of imperial control, became a bottom-up model of local survival. The spirit of the Pyridoxus did not die, it simply found a new, more pragmatic purpose. This was the true, unsung legacy of the Persian couriers. Their work, once an unglamorous part of a grand imperial machine, proved to be an essential and enduring part of human civilization. The network of communication they had created, based on their incredible endurance and their unyielding loyalty, outlasted the very empire that had created it. Their story reminds us that while empires may rise and fall, the basic human need to connect, to communicate, and to share information will always endure. The roads they once galloped on, now forgotten and overgrown, are a testament to the fact that the most significant contributions to history are often not the ones that are celebrated in song and story, but the ones that are quietly and tirelessly performed every single day. The famous quote from Herodotus, once a symbol of imperial power, now feels like a testament to the human spirit itself. The couriers did not simply serve a king, they served a fundamental human need. The next time you send an email or a text, remember the riders on the royal road, the men who, with nothing but a horse and an unyielding sense of duty, laid the very foundation for the interconnected world we live in today. Their story is a powerful reminder that the true strength of a civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the quiet, enduring resilience of its people. In the vast, interconnected world of the Roman Empire, the most important commodity was not gold or silk or spice. It was salt. For a man like Lucius, a salinator, or salt merchant, in the 2nd century AD, this humble mineral was the very foundation of his life and his livelihood. His world was one of meticulous measurement, of long journeys on dusty roads, and of the constant, low-level anxiety of a shipment lost to a storm or a bandit attack. The famous saying, "Worth his salt," was a direct reference to men like him, whose very profession was the backbone of an empire's economy and its daily life. You, in a world where salt is a cheap and abundant commodity, cannot begin to grasp its immense value in the ancient world. Before the invention of refrigeration, salt was not just a seasoning, it was a life-sustaining necessity. It was used to preserve meat and fish, to tan leather, and to manufacture glass. It was a form of currency, a source of tax revenue, and a strategic asset in a world where food preservation was a matter of life and death. The Roman state understood this perfectly and imposed a salarium, a tax on salt, which was a significant source of imperial income. The very word, salary, is a direct descendant of this tax, a testament to the fact that the Roman soldier's pay was often provided in a portion of salt. Lucius's daily life was a demanding, almost nomadic existence. He would travel from the coastal salt pans of Ostia, where salt was harvested in a painstaking, labor-intensive process, to the distant cities and military outposts that depended on a constant supply. His tools were a simple set of scales, a series of leather sacks, and a sturdy mule-drawn cart. The journey was long and arduous, and every mile was fraught with risk. The roads, though well-maintained, were not without their dangers. Bandits lay in wait in the isolated passes, and a sudden storm could turn a gentle river crossing into a treacherous obstacle. The logistics of the salt trade were a masterpiece of quiet, unglamorous coordination. Lucius had to secure his permits from the procurator Salus, the imperial salt official, and he had to pay his tax in advance. He had to be a master of negotiation, bargaining with the salt workers for a good price and haggling with the local merchants in the towns he visited. He was a professional risk-taker, though the risks were not those of a gladiator in the arena. His risks were a cart with a broken axle, a mule that went lame, or a sudden, unexpected drop in the price of salt. His greatest strength was his network, the salt workers he trusted, the cart drivers he hired, and the local traders with whom he had built a reputation for honesty and reliability. The salt that Lucius traded was not just a commodity, it was a symbol of Roman order and stability. The constant, predictable flow of salt was a sign that the empire was functioning as it should. It was a silent, unsung hero of the Roman economy, a testament to the fact that the greatness of a civilization often rests on the most boring and enduring of its systems. While the emperors waged their wars and the senators debated in the forum, men like Lucius were silently ensuring that the very fabric of society did not fall apart. However, this stable, predictable system had a weakness. It was utterly dependent on a continuous supply of resources and a stable political environment. What would happen to the world of a man like Lucius when the very fabric of that stability began to fray? How would a salt merchant, a man of quiet, methodical work, continue his job when the supply of salt ran dry and the great, unified state that funded his work began to show the first signs of internal decay? The crisis of the 3rd century did not spare a humble merchant like Lucius. The once stable world of Roman commerce began to falter, and for him, this meant a sudden, terrifying instability in the one commodity that had always been a constant, salt. The Salini, the great salt pans, were no longer operating at full capacity. The labor force, once a reliable source of manpower, was now being conscripted into the army or was fleeing to the countryside to escape the rising chaos. The roads, once secured by the imperial legions, were now a lawless no-man's land, a place where bandits and deserters preyed on merchants. The long, predictable journey from the coast to the interior had become a high-stakes gamble with a man's life and his livelihood. You, in a world of complex global trade and instant tracking, can't fully grasp the domino effect of a single logistical failure in the ancient world. A shortage of salt in one city meant that meat could not be preserved for the winter. A lack of preserved meat meant that soldiers on a distant frontier would have no rations, and a hungry army was a mutinous army. The Roman state, once a guarantor of order and stability, was now too preoccupied with internal civil wars and external invasions to concern itself with the mundane details of the salt trade. The procurator Saulus, the imperial salt official, was more concerned with his own survival than with the flow of a mineral. The tax on salt, once a steady source of income for the state, was now a source of conflict, as local officials, desperate for funds, began to impose their own arbitrary taxes and tolls, turning a simple journey into a bureaucratic nightmare. Lucius found himself in an impossible position. He could no longer rely on the state for protection, but he was still bound by its oppressive laws. His life's work, the quiet, unglamorous job of trading a life-sustaining commodity, had become an act of defiance. He and his fellow salt merchants began to travel in armed convoys, a desperate measure that increased their costs and made their trade even more precarious. They had to pay off local warlords and corrupt officials, a constant drain on their meager profits. The salt he sold, once a symbol of Roman order, now felt like a curse, a burden that brought with it a constant sense of danger and uncertainty. The great Roman saying, "worth his salt," began to take on a darker, more cynical meaning. A man was now worth his salt not because of his value to the state, but because of his ability to survive its collapse. Lucius's story is a profound example of how the grand narratives of history are often felt in the quiet, personal lives of ordinary people. The crisis of the 3rd century was not just a political crisis, it was a crisis of daily life, a period when the most basic necessities became a source of constant struggle and fear. The salt, once a symbol of a stable society, was now a symbol of its slow, painful decay. As Lucius made his way along a rutted, forgotten road, his cart groaning under the weight of his precious cargo, he had to confront a terrifying question. What happens when the most essential functions of a society can no longer be guaranteed? And what could a man whose only skill was trading a commodity do in a world that had lost all sense of value? The final act of Lucius's story is a testament to how even the most mundane and essential services will find a way to survive the collapse of a great system. The Roman state could no longer guarantee the salt trade, so the trade itself became a localized, community-driven enterprise. Lucius, a man whose life had been dedicated to serving a vast, centralized empire, found a new purpose in serving the small, resilient towns and villages that were fending for themselves. The salt that once flowed along the great imperial roads was now being traded on a smaller scale, in local markets and from a single merchant's cart. Lucius's business model changed dramatically. He no longer relied on the Roman army for protection or the imperial bureaucracy for his permits. He became a master of local diplomacy, making agreements with powerful landowners and village elders who were willing to provide him with protection in exchange for a steady supply of salt. The trade itself became a form of a local, unwritten contract, a handshake agreement based on trust and a shared need for a life-sustaining commodity. This was the true, unsung legacy of the salt trade, a quiet, but vital, transition from a top-down, centralized system to a bottom-up, community-based one. The Roman Empire, in its final, agonizing centuries, did not just disappear. It fragmented. Its grand, unified vision was replaced by 1,000 small, localized systems of survival. The salt trade, in its quiet, persistent way, was a physical manifestation of this change. It was a reminder that while the great, majestic empires of history may rise and fall, the basic human needs for food, security, and trade will always find a way to endure. Lucius, a man whose entire life had been defined by a simple, unglamorous commodity, was a silent witness to this profound transformation. His life was a testament to the fact that the true history of a civilization is not just in its moments of grandeur, but in its ability to adapt and persevere through the long, quiet process of decay. The next time you season your food with salt, remember its long and complicated history. Remember the men like Lucius, the silent and unsung heroes of a great empire, who risked everything to ensure that this most essential of commodities continued to flow. Their story reminds us that even in the most chaotic of times, the most boring and mundane aspects of life can be a profound testament to the resilience and enduring spirit of humanity. The vast, labyrinthine corridors of the Grand Bazaar in Ottoman Constantinople were not just a chaotic jumble of goods and people. They were a meticulously organized economic ecosystem, held together by the quiet, unglamorous work of men like Ahmed, a defterdar, or accountant, in the 16th century AD. His world was not one of adventure and intrigue, but of meticulous calculations, of ink-stained fingers, and of the constant, low-level anxiety of a ledger that refused to balance. His profession was the silent, almost invisible engine that powered the empire's economy, a testament to the fact that for a great civilization to thrive, its bureaucracy must be as efficient as its military. You, in an age of digital spreadsheets and automated financial software, cannot fully comprehend the sheer intellectual and physical labor involved in this task. The Grand Bazaar was the heart of the Ottoman economy, a hub of global trade where goods from Europe, Asia, and Africa converged. Silks from China, spices from India, carpets from Persia, and furs from Russia, all of it flowed through this one, magnificent market. Ahmed's job was to be the vigilant record-keeper of this flow. He worked in a small, cramped office, the air thick with the scent of leather, dust, and the faint, sweet smell of cinnamon. His tools were a simple set of abacuses, a collection of meticulously crafted quills, and a series of heavy, leather-bound ledgers. The language he used was a precise, almost mathematical form of Ottoman Turkish, a language understood only by a select few. The process of a single transaction was a complex, multi-step affair. A merchant would come to Ahmed to record a sale or a purchase. Ahmed would have to verify the legitimacy of the transaction, ensuring that the goods were properly taxed and that the sale was legal. He had to be a master of many different currencies, from the Ottoman aki to the Venetian ducat, and he had to be able to convert between them on the fly. He had to record the details of the transaction in his ledger, a document that was not just a list of numbers but a legal record, a bill of sale that served as proof of ownership and a source for tax collection. Every single transaction, no matter how small, had to be documented, for it was all part of the vast, interconnected network of commerce that held the empire together. The ledger, or defter, was more than just a book, it was the living memory of the bazaar. It was a document that reflected the health of the economy, the flow of goods, and the prosperity of the merchants. Ahmed's work was a quiet act of immense power. He was the guardian of the market's fiscal health, an invisible hand that ensured the Sultan's treasury was full and that the laws of the empire were being followed. The stability of a kingdom, a reality that seemed so distant and grand, was built on the quiet diligence of a man who spent his days counting coins and recording transactions. Ahmed was a member of a respected guild of accountants and scribes, a professional class that was vital to the functioning of the Ottoman state. He lived a life of relative comfort, free from the physical toil of a common laborer. His power came not from physical strength, but from his knowledge, a knowledge that was passed down through generations in a system that valued precision and accuracy above all else. He was a keeper of secrets, a master of a language that governed the empire's economy and its social structure. Yet, this system, so seemingly perfect and unchangeable, had a weakness. It was a system built on paper and ink, a system that was utterly dependent on a stable political environment and the integrity of the men who ran it. What would happen to the world of a man like Ahmed when the very fabric of the empire, the stable, bureaucratic system he had dedicated his life to, began to unravel? And how would a man whose power was based on meticulous record-keeping survive in a world where corruption and political intrigue became the new normal? The the 16th and 17th centuries were a time of slow, quiet change for the Ottoman Empire. The once unbending imperial bureaucracy began to show the first signs of decay, and for a man like Ahmed, this was not a matter of grand political philosophy but a very real and dangerous professional reality. Corruption, once a rarity, began to seep into the system, and for a defterdar whose entire life was based on the sanctity of the ledger, this was a profound and unsettling change. The honesty that had once been his greatest virtue now felt like a liability. He was no longer a silent guardian of the economy, he was a witness to its silent and insidious subversion. In a world where corporate fraud and political corruption are often exposed by a whistleblower, must imagine a world where such a crime could be carried out with complete impunity. Ahmed began to receive subtle and then not so subtle requests from powerful figures, a vizier, a pasha, a wealthy merchant with powerful connections. They would ask him to adjust the ledgers, to underreport a shipment's value, or to quietly erase a debt. The choices he faced were grim. He could refuse and risk losing his position, his livelihood, and even his life, or he could comply and become a silent accomplice in the very corruption he had sworn to prevent. The final act of Ahmed's story is a profound lesson in the enduring power of truth and the quiet rebellion of integrity. The Ottoman Empire, in its long, slow decline, did not crumble in a single, cataclysmic event. It was, in many ways, hollowed out from within by the very corruption that Ahmed was forced to witness. The grand, centralized system that had once been the envy of the world became a cumbersome, inefficient machine, its wealth siphoned off by a powerful and increasingly corrupt elite. The ledger, once a symbol of imperial strength, became a testament to its weakness. But in the midst of this decay, men like Ahmed, the silent guardians of the system, found a way to preserve their integrity and, in the process, to protect the very idea of a fair and just economy. Ahmed could not change the system, but he could change his relationship with it. He continued to make the adjustments demanded by the powerful, but he began to keep a second, secret ledger. In this private record, he meticulously documented every fraudulent transaction, every bribe, and every quiet act of subversion. This was not a document of state, but a document of conscience. It was a testament to his belief that even if the world was in disarray, the truth still mattered. His new work was not about power, but about remembrance. He understood that the history of an empire is not just told in its official edicts and grand monuments, but also in the quiet, unrecorded moments of its people. His private ledgers, filled with the mundane details of corruption and deceit, were a more honest and enduring monument than any grand palace. This quiet, personal act of resistance was not without its risks. The very act of keeping a separate, truthful record was a treasonous act in a system that valued the illusion of stability over the messy reality of decline. But for Ahmed, it was a matter of professional integrity. He was a defterdar, a man whose life's work was the truth, and he could not abide the idea of his skills being used to perpetuate a lie. He understood that the grand, glorious narrative of the Sultan's power was a fiction, and he chose to be a chronicler of the reality. In the end, the official records of the late 16th and 17th century Ottoman Empire tell a story of a gradual, but manageable, decline. They speak of a stable government, a resilient economy, and a sultan who maintained control. But the private records of men like Ahmed, hidden in a small, cramped office in the heart of the Grand Bazaar, tell a very different story. They tell a story of a civilization that was not dying, but transforming, a story of how a seemingly perfect system can be hollowed out from within by the realities of a changing world. Ahmed's act reminds us that the power of a single document, and a single human heart, can be a profound force for truth. The history of the Ottoman Empire, in all its complexity, is not just about the grand narratives of its sultans and its armies. It is also about the quiet, persistent work of countless, unsung individuals who, one entry at a time, wrote the true story of their time. The next time you walk through a bustling market, remember the accountants who work in the shadows, for their boring, unglamorous work is the silent, beating heart of a civilization. The Great Library of Alexandria, in the 3rd century BC, was not just a collection of scrolls, it was a physical embodiment of a civilization's ambition to collect all the knowledge in the world. But this grand ambition was not realized by kings or philosophers alone. It was the result of the unglamorous, constant work of men like Demetrius, a bibliophilax, or librarian, whose life was a monotonous cycle of cataloging, transcribing, and preserving the vast papyrus scrolls that filled its stacks. His world was not one of great intellectual debates, but of the soft rustle of papyrus, the faint scent of ink and dust, and the methodical, almost hypnotic work of a man who saw his duty as a quiet, endless battle against time and decay. You, in a world where information is instantly searchable with a few keystrokes, cannot begin to grasp the sheer logistical and administrative complexity of managing such a collection. The Library of Alexandria was an unprecedented feat of intellectual and bureaucratic organization. Its collection was a sprawling, decentralized network of knowledge, with scrolls stored in different sections and in various languages. Demetrius's job was to be the vigilant record-keeper of this system. He worked in a small, cramped office, the air thick with the scent of aged papyrus and the tang of 1,000 different stories. His tools were a simple set of clay tablets for note-taking, a stylus, and a series of meticulously crafted scrolls for his official catalog. The language he used was a precise, almost mathematical form of Greek, a language understood only by a select few. The process of acquiring and cataloging a single scroll was a meticulous, multi-step affair. A ship would arrive in the harbor of Alexandria, its cargo often a mix of exotic goods and a precious few scrolls from a distant land. Demetrius would have to examine each scroll, assess its authenticity, and determine its subject matter. He would then have to decide whether it was worthy of being copied for the library's collection. If it was, he would send it to the scriptorium, where a team of scribes would painstakingly transcribe it, a process that could take weeks or even months. The new copy would then be returned to Demetrius, who would have to create a new entry in his catalog, or pinax. The catalog was not just a simple list, it was a complex, cross-referenced system that indexed scrolls by author, subject, and genre, a kind of ancient search engine that was the key to unlocking the library's vast collection. The library was more than just a place of learning, it was a symbol of Ptolemaic power and a tool of intellectual diplomacy. The Ptolemies, the Hellenistic rulers of Egypt, used the library to project their power and prestige, inviting scholars from all over the world to study and to contribute to its collection. But this grand vision was entirely dependent on the quiet, unglamorous work of men like Demetrius. He was a silent guardian of the world's knowledge, an invisible hand that ensured that a rare text from a distant land would not be lost to history. His work was a quiet act of immense power. He was the keeper of the library's fiscal and intellectual health, an unsung hero who ensured that the flame of knowledge would continue to burn brightly. Yet, this system, so seemingly perfect and unchangeable, had a weakness. It was a physical library in a world of political intrigue and constant warfare. What would happen to the world of a man like Demetrius when the very fabric of the empire, the stable, bureaucratic system he had dedicated his life to, began to unravel? And how would a man whose power was based on meticulous record-keeping and the preservation of books survive in a world where violence and destruction became the new normal? The tranquility of the great library of Alexandria was not to last. For Demetrius, the decline of the Ptolemaic dynasty was not a distant political event but a very real and present danger that began to encroach upon the sanctity of his work. The city, once a cosmopolitan hub of learning and trade, was now a tinderbox of political intrigue and ethnic strife. The rulers of the empire, once patrons of the arts and sciences, were now more concerned with consolidating their power and fighting off rivals. The consistent flow of funds that had once supported the library's acquisition efforts began to falter, and with it, the very lifeblood of the institution. You, in a world where information is stored in the ephemeral cloud, cannot grasp the physical vulnerability of the great library. Its collection was made of papyrus, a fragile and highly flammable material. Its very existence was a constant, low-level risk. The library was not just a symbol of learning, it was a symbol of Ptolemaic power, and in a city where power was constantly being contested, it became a target. For Demetrius, the first signs of trouble were not the sound of a riot but the whispers in the stacks, the rumors of unrest, and the unsettling sight of soldiers marching through the streets. The first great tragedy to befall the library was not a single, cataclysmic fire, but a series of small, intentional acts of neglect and destruction. The scrolls, once seen as a national treasure, were now seen as a political liability. In the power struggles that defined the late Ptolemaic period, rival factions would burn or confiscate scrolls to weaken their opponents. The once sacred act of transcription and preservation was now a dangerous political act. Demetrius found himself in an impossible position. He could either follow the orders of a corrupt and short-sighted ruler and destroy the very knowledge he was sworn to protect, or he could try to save what he could, a quiet act of defiance that could cost him his life. The library itself became a place of immense stress. The scholars, once a community of shared purpose, were now divided along political lines. The atmosphere, once one of intellectual curiosity, was now thick with suspicion and fear. Demetrius's work, once a quiet act of devotion, was now a constant moral compromise. He had to decide, on a daily basis, which scrolls to save and which to sacrifice, knowing that each decision was a small, agonizing act of a cultural triage. This was the true, unglamorous reality of the library's decline. It was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, quiet erosion of a system that had once seemed indestructible. The great debates of the past were being replaced by a more desperate, survivalist mentality. The very idea of universal knowledge, the grand vision of the library's founders, was being abandoned in favor of a more localized, self-preserving approach. As Demetrius hid a precious scroll on a subject he knew little about, he had to confront a terrifying question. What happens when the truth becomes a liability? And what could a man whose only power was knowledge do in a world that had no use for it anymore? The final act of Demetrius's story is not a tragic tale of total loss, but a quiet, enduring lesson in the power of human resilience and the ultimate futility of trying to destroy an idea. The great library of Alexandria, as a physical institution, did eventually succumb to a series of fires and acts of neglect over centuries. Its grand, centralized vision of a single repository for all knowledge in the world was, in the end, an unsustainable model. But the knowledge itself did not disappear. It simply fragmented, its grand imperial purpose replaced by a more pragmatic, localized, and human-driven model. You, who can access the wisdom of the world from a device in your hand, must appreciate the profound significance of this fragmentation. When the library began to fall apart, its scholars and librarians, men like Demetrius, did not simply abandon their work. They scattered, carrying what they could, often just a single, precious scroll. They became intellectual refugees, and in their dispersal, they spread the knowledge of the library throughout the Hellenistic world. The scrolls that were once a part of a single, majestic collection were now being copied and studied in new centers of learning, in places like Rhodes, Pergamon, and even in the distant city of Rome. The Library of Alexandria, in essence, did not die. It became a decentralized, living library of 1,000 small, scattered collections. Demetrius's final act of defiance was not a grand, dramatic rescue. It was a series of small, quiet acts of preservation. He chose to hide not the most valuable or the most famous scrolls, but the ones that were most vulnerable and least likely to be copied elsewhere. He became a master of intellectual triage, saving the works of obscure poets, forgotten historians, and lesser-known scientists, knowing that their work was the most likely to be lost forever. His new work was not about glory, but about a profound sense of duty to the past and to the future. He understood that the history of an empire is not just told in its grand monuments and its moments of triumph, but also in the small, unrecorded moments of a single librarian quietly preserving a single, precious scroll. The history of the great library of Alexandria, in all its complexity, is a powerful reminder that the true strength of a civilization lies not in the physical grandeur of its institutions, but in its ability to adapt and persevere through the long, quiet process of decay. The knowledge that was once contained in a single building did not die with it. It lived on in the minds and the hands of the men who had dedicated their lives to its preservation. The next time you hold a book, remember the long and winding journey that its contents took to reach you. Remember the men who, with a single quill and an unyielding sense of purpose, laid the very foundations for the world of knowledge we live in today. The greatness of the Roman Empire was not forged in the fires of battle alone, it was paid for with the silent, tireless work of countless individuals toiling in the mundane, unglamorous heart of its economy. For a man like Gaius, a Metallicus or mining supervisor in the 1st century AD, this meant a life spent in the deep, dark confines of the mines of Rio Tinto in modern-day Spain. This vast, copper-rich deposit was the largest of its kind in the Roman world, and its monotonous, back-breaking labor was the quiet engine that fueled the entire imperial machine. You, in a world of complex financial markets and digital currencies, cannot truly grasp the immense strategic importance of a single mineral in the ancient world, for copper was the lifeblood of Rome's military, its infrastructure, and its daily life. The Arius, the copper coin that was the most common currency in the empire, was not just a piece of metal, it was a physical manifestation of Rome's power and stability. It was the currency used for a soldier's daily pay, for the purchase of bread in a market, and for the payment of 100 different taxes. The constant, predictable flow of copper from the mines of Spain was a vital artery of the Roman economy. Without a steady supply of this mundane mineral, the entire system would grind to a halt. Gaius's job was to ensure that this flow never stopped. He was not an engineer or a general, but a man of the earth, a silent guardian of the empire's fiscal health. Gaius's daily life was a demanding, almost nomadic existence. He would spend his days deep in the mines, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and dust, the only light coming from the flicker of an oil lamp. His tools were a simple set of pickaxes, shovels, and buckets. He was a master of 100 different small, unglamorous tasks, identifying a rich vein of ore, directing a team of laborers, and ensuring that the tunnels were structurally sound. He was a professional risk-taker, though the risks were not those of a gladiator in the arena. His risks were a sudden cave-in, a poisonous gas pocket, or a sudden, unexpected flood. His greatest strength was his network, the engineers who designed the mines, the laborers who worked in them, and the merchants who transported the ore to the smelters. The logistics of the mining operation were a masterpiece of quiet, unglamorous coordination. The ore had to be mined, crushed, and then transported on a long, arduous journey to the coast, where it would be shipped to the great smelters of Italy and Gaul. Each stage of this process was meticulously documented, for a single mistake could result in a massive loss of profit. The Roman state understood the immense value of this work and placed the mines under the direct control of the emperor. The Metallici were a highly trusted and vetted part of the imperial machine, a professional class whose loyalty to the state was a matter of immense importance. However, this stable, predictable system had a weakness. It was a system built on a continuous supply of labor and a stable political environment. What would happen to the world of a man like Gaius when the very fabric of that stability began to fray? How would a mining supervisor, a man of quiet, methodical work, continue his job when the supply of labor ran dry and the great, unified state that funded his work began to show the first signs of internal decay? The crisis of the 3rd century, a period of political instability and economic decline, was not an abstract concept for Gaius. It was a tangible, physical reality that he experienced deep in the earth. The constant, methodical rhythm of the mines began to falter. The supply of labor, once a reliable torrent of both free men and slaves, slowed to a trickle. The constant civil wars and the growing threat of barbarian incursions meant that the state was conscripting the very men who had once toiled in the mines. The once dependable supply of tools and food from the central authority was now intermittent and unreliable. You, who are used to the efficiency of a global supply chain, must imagine the psychological toll of a sudden and complete breakdown in the most basic logistics. The very air in the mines, once a symbol of imperial power, now felt heavy with a sense of foreboding and neglect. The mines themselves began to show the signs of this decay. The timbers that supported the ceilings were rotting, the drainage systems were clogging, and the air was becoming stagnant and dangerous. Gaius was forced to become a master of improvisation, using his knowledge not to expand the mines but to keep them from collapsing entirely. He and his team began to use salvaged timber and old tools, a testament to the fact that the Roman state, once a symbol of engineering and organization, was now a symbol of a desperate and frantic struggle for survival. The ore they mined, once a source of wealth for the emperor, was now a source of conflict, as local warlords and corrupt officials began to demand a share of the profits. The copper, once a symbol of Roman power, was now a symbol of its slow, painful decay. The Metallici, the skilled miners who had once been a part of a well-organized and respected guild, were now a fragmented group, each one a silent witness to the collapse of their world. The sense of shared purpose that had once defined their profession was gone, replaced by a grim sense of self-preservation. This was the true, unglamorous reality of a declining empire, the corrosion of trust at the most basic, human level. The mines, once a testament to Roman engineering, were now a silent witness to its failure. The grand, unified vision of a centralized state, where the emperor provided for the needs of the people, was being replaced by a more fragmented, self-reliant model. As Gaius supervised a small, exhausted team of laborers, he had to confront a terrifying question. What happens when the most essential functions of a society can no longer be maintained? And what could a man whose only skill was digging a mineral out of the earth do in a world that had lost all sense of value? The final act of Gaius's story is not a tragic tale of the Roman mining industry's demise, but a quiet, enduring lesson in the power of human ingenuity and the fundamental, unwavering need for a basic resource. The Roman state's grand, centralized system of mining did eventually collapse, unable to sustain itself in a world of constant chaos. But the need for copper did not. It simply fragmented, its grand imperial purpose replaced by a more pragmatic, localized, and human-driven model. The mines of Rio Tinto, once a source of wealth for the emperor, became a source of livelihood for a small, resilient community of miners. You, who are used to the vast scale of modern industrial mining, must appreciate the profound significance of this shift. When the imperial bureaucracy abandoned the mines, Gaius and his team did not simply walk away. They became their own masters, working with what they had and for their own survival. The ore they mined was no longer for the emperor's coffers, but for the local communities and the emerging military leaders who were carving out their own small, independent fiefdoms. The copper that had once flowed to the imperial mints of Rome was now being used to forge local tools, weapons, and even to trade for food and supplies. The mines of Rio Tinto, in essence, did not die, they became a localized, living example of a more resilient, bottom-up economy. Gaius's final act of defiance was not a grand, dramatic rebellion. It was a series of small, quiet acts of preservation. He chose to focus on the most accessible and easily mined veins of ore, knowing that his goal was no longer about maximizing profit for a distant emperor, but about ensuring the survival of his community. His work was a profound act of a quiet, unyielding duty to the future. He understood that the history of an empire is not just told in its grand triumphs and its moments of decline, but also in the small, unrecorded moments of a single miner quietly digging for ore. The history of the Roman copper mines, in all their complexity, is a powerful reminder that the true strength of a civilization lies not in the grandeur of its institutions, but in its ability to adapt and persevere through the long, quiet process of decay. The copper that was once a symbol of a powerful, unified state did not lose its value. It simply found a new purpose, a new meaning, a new way to fuel a world that was slowly being reborn. The next time you see a copper coin, or a piece of copper wire, remember the long and winding journey that its contents took to reach you. Remember the men who, with a single pickaxe and an unyielding sense of purpose, laid the very foundations for the world we live in today.